As the governor of California, Reagan had continued a trend of deinstitutionalization, abolishing involuntary hospitalization except for in extreme cases. To be clear, the likelihood of receiving poor or abusive treatment in asylums and hospitals was well documented in the mid-20th century. Rather than reforming such hospitals to be beacons of treatment, which costs money and requires government oversight, again, Republicans hate big government, or so they say, unless it's about war. Anyways, hospitals were closed. Removing mentally ill patients who could manage and function in society with a bit of care and resources was desired by advocates, but there were others who needed more supervision. So during the 1970s, California, which is typically the progressive legislative leader, sent more and more patients from hospitals into the lucrative board and care facilities, a bustling for-profit industry. Many board and care facilities were placed in struggling neighborhoods where there was crime and cheaply plentiful drugs. Treatment of the mentally ill in these facilities was not always much better than the quality of life at asylums. Many indigent or troubled mentally ill people were kicked out of facilities who didn't want to provide costly specialized care, and others left voluntarily. By the 80s, the demographics of the unhoused were shifting from single white men, typically older and alcoholics, to a wider variety, as I discussed in this video about homelessness. Said a New York City shelter director in 1984, "We're just getting loads of people. It's hard to figure out who they are. All we know is that they're younger and blacker." There are several reasons why homelessness grew. In New York, the number of adult mental hospital inmates between 1965 and 1981 went from 85,000 to 23,000, with an estimated 47,000 ending up on the streets of the city. At the same time, the Big Apple wanted to attract higher income residents who had been living in surrounding suburbs since the 40s, so it offered tax incentives to encourage owners of cheap rooming houses and single-room occupancy hotels to convert them to pricey condos and rental apartments. Roughly 60% of affordable single-room occupancy hotel rooms were gone by 1981. This happened in many cities. Affordable housing would steadily dry up as cost of living rose in the decades to come. The Coalition for the Homeless had been founded in 1981 by Robert Hayes, a lawyer who litigated a New York case establishing that all unhoused people have the right to emergency shelter. Within 3 years of this agreement, there were 18 city-run public shelters that were struggling to house the homeless population. And the main goal of homeless shelters was not to solve homelessness, but rather to slap a band-aid on it. Said the Deputy Administrator for the Human Resources Administration, "Our goals are very clear. Temporary shelter so no one freezes to death." Despite being warned about a prospective housing crisis in 1982, the Reagan administration stopped plans to build federally subsidized low-income housing, raised rent on such housing, and introduced cheap housing vouchers. And in true villain fashion, when the unhoused came up on the 1984 campaign trail, Reagan said, "The people who are sleeping on the grates, the homeless who are homeless, you might say by choice." Until the mid-80s, what was missing from much discourse by homelessness activists as well as dicks like Reagan was the importance of mental health. Simply providing a job and a home were not enough when poor mental health, trauma, and drug use were a part of the equation. Rebecca Smith was a 61-year-old black former pianist and college valedictorian with a family actively trying to bring her home when she froze to death in a cardboard hut in January 1982. She had been diagnosed as a schizophrenic and hospitalized for 10 years, where she had been subject to electromagnetic therapy, which did more damage to her mental state. Before her death, there were numerous attempts to move her to an unhoused shelter, and the city even sought a court order to forcibly remove her, but could not secure one in time. On October 28, 1987, the same year that Democrats successfully pushed the McKinney Act, which gave over $1 billion to homeless programs, a woman named Joyce Brown was involuntarily committed to Bellevue Hospital under Project Help, Mayor Ed Koch's new initiative to remove erratic behaving mentally ill people from the streets using doctors and nurses in vans. Koch said, "If the crazies want to sue me, they have every right to sue, and by crazies, I'm talking about those who say, no, you have no right to intervene to help." Declaring, "I'm not insane, just unhoused," the former Secretary Joyce Brown, who had been diagnosed as psychotic, also had a drug addiction. Her 4 sisters had been looking for her and trying to get her to come back home. In addition to yelling insults to people, especially black men, she was a frequent traffic hazard who referred to herself as Billy Boggs, a local TV personality. While committed, Joyce secured representation by the Civil Liberties Union, who contested Koch Koch's program. Joyce was released after 11 weeks and immediately was asked to speak at Harvard University on homelessness, identifying as a political prisoner. Reported the New York Times, not too long ago, Joyce Brown lived on an Upper East Side sidewalk in front of a restaurant's hot air vent. She hurled insults at some passersby, made friends with others, and used the street for her bathroom. But in a little more than 3 months, Ms. Brown, 40 years old, has been transformed from an anonymous street person into something of a media star. She has dined at Windows on the World and compiled a list of favorite restaurants. She has shopped at Bloomingdale's, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Lord & Taylor. She was interviewed on national and local television and received half a dozen movie and book offers. The case was seen by conservatives as a woman winning the right to be homeless, and for liberals, a win for bodily autonomy. Unfortunately, Brown's poor mental episodes continued, as well as her heroin use, and the newfound spotlight probably didn't help matters. New York Magazine found her on the streets, back to her erratic behavior within 3 weeks of her Harvard speech. Eventually, she was moved into a long-term supervised residence for the mentally ill, and the movie and book offers never came to fruition. Nationwide, involuntary hospitalization and medical treatment continued to become illegal since the 70s, and mentally ill, unhoused people in dire need of treatment often continued self-medicating, making them prime targets of harassment, street violence, and arrests by the police. Summed up a psychiatrist, police regard arrest and booking into jail as a more reliable way of securing involuntary detention of mentally disordered persons. So, plenty of mentally ill people were given freedom and autonomy when turned out on the streets from mental hospitals, where they could not be compelled to take prescribed medicine, only to be re-detained in jail cells after a lack of the treatment they needed. The proportion of prison inmates with untreated mental illness would only grow, while the overall prison population grew from roughly 330,000 prisoners in 1980 to 771,000 by the decade's end.